Okay, so my questions are, tell me a little bit about your environmental background and why you participate in creation care ministry and what drives that passion.
Okay, so I'm having that slight moment of sort of being modest, but I, from an early age, always felt really drawn to nature, and so I don't know if we would have had the words back then, but I was like a classically bookish, socially awkward young person that nevertheless felt incredible freedom being in nature. And what's crazy is what nature was. I mean, here we are in the Northwest where nature is volcanoes and Puget Sound, etc. I was in the farmland of northern Ohio, and nature was a creek that had some scraggly trees around it. And then the I don't know if you're familiar with the term like hedgerows, like between like fields, there would often be a line, particularly on a property line, there might be, like a 30-foot wide swath of sort of trees and wildland, etc. And so, I always liked being out, and didn't realize, you know, until, as I sort of grew older, the degree to which like that was such a draw for me, in a place where I felt peace, but also curiosity, like kind of what's this and what's that, um, and didn't really realize that like you could do that as a career until sometime in college, when I started to realize like, oh, I was actually good at science and math, and that okay, I'm telling this too long, you're gonna have to like I had the opportunity
Well, we
in
can edit it.
in 1973 to travel in the Amazon basin, like on riverboats in the Amazon. And it was right when the Brazilian government had put in a program that was starting to build roads that would then allow, Brazilian settlers to come into indigenous land and sort of pull down the forest. And literally from these riverboats, we would see the big bulldozers coming in and tearing down the forest. And it was, nobody was talking about it then, but there was just like this, here's this magnificent thing, and here is a government tearing down a forest. And in my 20-something-year-old mind, like there was kind of this sense of alertness, like. And what was crazy, Kylie, was I was at the University of Wisconsin, and I went back to I was in the botany department. It was a really famous botany department with famous people in it. I went back and I said, like, I just saw this thing, and it's a problem. And they were like, I think you should take plant physiology, and it was like, you should like understand cellular structures, and so this big picture, there was no place for me to like articulate it. So there's kind of a career trajectory of that 20-something-year-old person saying, there is something fundamentally changing our world at an unprecedented scale. I mean, like there was this intuitive conviction, and that I was in a very prestigious public research institution, and there was no place to have that conversation, because it was a conversation that was about a scale of understanding the earth and humans' impact on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went on, Kylie, and in doing then, and in that little article with the link I sent you, it's like I started to work on paleoclimate, because I was trying to understand what is the natural variability of the system, and if I say to you, Kylie, like, you should drive a Prius, like, how do I as a scientist have the credibility to say, like, and I am sure that carbon dioxide from human activity is changing our climate. Like, I wanted that to be so sure to like put into that. But the whole time I'm like trying to figure out, like, there's a piece of me that's trying to figure out, like, how do we get institutions of higher education or non-governmental organizations or whatever, how do we like fundamentally grapple with the fact that we as humans are driving the planet? Kylie, like, if you think about, as we grew up, we thought about environmental impacts as like we were polluting the stream down the road, or that smokestack, was polluting my neighborhood and causing asthma. And that the planet, the earth was its own thing. Kylie, we are literally on, have our hands on the steering wheel of the entire earth system. And trying to figure out how we embed that understanding in, for me, in most of my career, it's been in higher education. How do I create the spaces for the 20-something-year-olds that were like me at 20-something to study that, to have remote sensing tools and models that allow us to do that, to have conversations about what are governance structures that allow us to, not have the kind of policy failure that we've had with the Paris climate accords. How do we, we kind of did okay with the ozone hole. Like, how come we can't do that again? So like, how do we kind of bring that all together? And then to sort of really fast forward, then, realizing that the place, I could get political scientists and sociologists and demographers and atmospheric scientists, I could convene, and government officials and activists, I could get everybody at the table. But what was missing was, particularly in a public university setting, was to be able to say, and it's wrong. like to have this ethical, values-based, theology-based, if we're going to drive the planet, we have to do it with care. And there was, there's kind of no place for that. And so realized that in my own spirituality, that it was really kind of like this duh moment of like, oh, there's like communities of faith that are organizing around this, and it's the missing piece. It's the piece where we sit around creation care meetings and in conversations with our St. Mark's community and with these larger communities of faith, and we say, this is not right, and how do we make it better? And how do we make it better in a way that acknowledges us as spiritual beings, as people who live in communities that are, and have historically and to this day are experiencing injustice? I mean, how do we put all those pieces together? So my excitement about being part of Creation Care at St. Mark's is that I feel like I found my tribe, that it's where I can have a conversation. And right now I'm, my goal is to find ways of building bridges between, on some level, I'm the science community, and communities of faith, and make sure we've got the science flowing into the community of faith, but we've got the community of faith perspectives on what a spiritually based activism looks like in these times. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Wow, that's incredible. Going back to the experience in the Amazon, which is such that larger macro level, when you received that response to focus on, was it plant physiology?
Yeah. Like I needed to like get these courses done for my major. Like, I should stop thinking about this. It's like, oh yeah, like my major.
But so I have a question with that, because focusing on such a micro level, does doing something like that also help to inform
Oh,
everything else?
Kylie, you know, that's a very astute question. So a lot of what I feel like, and I've gotten better and better at this, but even back then I realized, oh, I have to have credentials. Like I'm this like 20-year-old with hippie clothes on, kind of going, hey, 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 and like these professors are like, whatever. And that, finishing up my scientific training and getting my PhD and getting a deep understanding of the natural science, the physical, the atmospheric physics of clouds,
Mm.
and why greenhouse gas, how they operate in the atmosphere, and why clouds create positive feedback. I mean, like having all of that technical expertise,
Mm-hmm.
quite frankly, particularly as a woman, to like walk into these conversations and to have that expertise was important. And so it turns out that an understanding of the system, the natural science system, in fact, things that happen at cellular levels, and cloud
Mm-hmm.
particles and reflectivity and all that is part of a lot of how we have what can be really scary positive feedbacks in these systems, where a little bit of warming can lead to a lot of big impacts, and understanding that is really critical.
Mm.
But it's a really, I watch it with my own students, which is like, this kind of credentialing bit is like so freaking tedious, and like, a lot of, I feel like we're always like saying like, well, go back and learn all this stuff before you get to be like a real scientist out in the real world. And it's like, no, like, can't we short circuit that and, have them go in parallel? So.
Interesting. Well, actually, my next question is, do you feel like through your journey, you were called, or God called you to this work? Or when did that intersect in your career and journey?
So I I grew up in a family that our practice of Christianity was very much it was less that God called you like on a telephone, like than part of one's spirituality was thinking about one's purpose in life and being willing to do hard and unconventional things. And this was very much embodied in my mother, who herself was an Episcopal deacon, who served in a African-American parish in downtown Toledo and worked on peace and justice issues in the upper Midwest. And so growing up with my mother, it was like, like, there's a problem, and how are we as a community going to address it? And I mean, there are any number of times where I would kind of balk, and she kind of like, I felt like on some level, she was encouraging me to hear a voice of God in seeing things, and to be, I don't think she'd ever say fearless, because she was certainly knew her fears, but to act in the face of sort of fearlessness, and just be willing to embrace failure, and to just sort of move forward. So I guess the answer to that is, I think I have felt called to make a difference in the world, and felt that it was um, I learned how to respond to that call. Because I think
Mhm.
sometimes we get called and it's like, WTF, like, okay. Like, well, looks I'd like to do that, but like, oh man. I think I just feel really grateful for having watched people around me
Mm.
rise to occasions.
It sounds like you have, with your mother, some really incredible leadership and guidance and family surrounding you to guide you to what you've
Yeah,
become, to be
yeah.
part of that. That's incredible.
I feel really, really fortunate. Um, and, you know, some of it is also like in your family of origin, you're normed on it. And you don't realize until much later in life, like, oh, you know, like there were ways I was raised to like confront fears and move beyond them.
Mhm.
It's kind of a operational thing that other people get have different kinds of skills and values that are sort of instilled on them.
Mhm.
So
Wow, that's amazing. That's incredible. So how did you decide, you talked about your formative years in Ohio. How
mhm.
did you decide once you got to college, university, that that was the path you were going on? Or was that the Amazon?
No, you know what? The real clincher is this story I tell about the drought of '77,
Mhm.
um, which, you know, we're so used to drought now, but the drought of 1977, going from the US Mexico border to the US Canadian border, and in particular, like in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, all of a sudden, you know, you couldn't flush the toilet if there was pee in it, you know, like you couldn't water your lawn, you couldn't wash your car. I mean, you know, like we were just like, oh my goodness, like droughts
Mhm.
are real. It was the first big drought since the Dust Bowl. So we had all through the 50s and 60s and early 70s, like, you know, people didn't think about drought. So we get hit by this drought. And it's not just a little drought, you know, it's like the whole West Coast. And I tell the story in that little article about, I'm in Wisconsin, I'm taking a climate class, and the professor just really casually is kind of, you know, we're talking about this drought and it's kind of blowing me away. And then the clincher for him is he just kind of off the cuff says, you know, we don't know if this is climate change or is this natural variability. And I'm just like, what? Like, really? Like you don't know that?
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God. And the visceral nature of it, I think really came from like this, like being on my grandfather's farm and like thinking like, if climate change is like, you know, it's not just like you can't wash your car, like, or you have to flush your toilet in different ways. It's like
Mhm.
big. And and so I it was a turning point for me. I mean, it was an absolute turning point. Right. So I kind of got my courage up and like started chatting with that faculty member, and he's the one that introduced me to the idea that like, well, the reason we don't know is that we don't know what the natural variability is, and we've got to look back in time. And man, I was all over it. Like, okay, you know, that's what I'm doing. And and Kylie, what's crazy is that that's like, this is like the 1970s. I rode my career, so I just started to study climate change, and in the 1980s and 1990s, it almost seems like impossible to believe. The US, including under Republican administrations, invested more money in coordinated studies of global climate change than any other initiative post-Cold War.
Wow.
It was, and so you know, in terms of like, and Kylie, I don't know exactly what you and your husband do, but like, so like here I am, I'm like being a scientist, and I'm like writing this, you know, I'm getting big grants, partly because like the world is investing in this, and the European Union's investing in it, and the Japanese are investing in it. So like I'm building out this part of the university at a time. And what's crazy, particularly in the Bush administration, they were funneling all this money in because they didn't want to take action. They wanted, it was a really cynical strategy, which is we don't know enough science. So, we can't take action. So we're just going to instead of taking action, we're just going to fund the scientists. And so okay, I'm the beneficiary kind of that. But, but, if you think about other people that as scientists or activists identify really critical things and never have the institutional support to sort of really go to town. And so as a relatively young person, this whole world opened up for me, Kylie, in terms of resources. And it was, and a lot of it was global. It was, we realized that, I kind of go back to this image of we're driving the planet. We had to take the planet's temperature, not just in North America or Europe or Japan. We had to have the whole thing. So we had to develop capacity and collaboration with sub-Saharan Africa and with Asia. And it was a time when China was completely, walled off. And I was one of the first scientists to go in to China to start seeing, could we start sharing data? And it was back when the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union. We finally got them to share data. It was back in the day of computer cards, and we got these cards, and we're all excited because the Soviet Union, which is a big chunk of the world, they had agreed to send us the data. And we start looking at it, and it's so screwy. They got permission to send us the data, but they had to scramble the geocodes that indicated where the data were collected. So imagine you got all of the weather station data from the US, but Charlottesville was really identified as Fargo, and Fargo was identified as Tampa. And so yeah, you had data, but it's I tell that story to my students who are used to data being exchanged, et cetera. I was that was the level, in terms of just what my job kind of in this space was to kind of sit there and kind of then say to the Soviet scientists, this was a good first step, but it's all screwed up. We really need you to talk to some people about, can we actually get the geocodes?
Wow.
So
So
it was
in regards to that, if you're working with sub-Saharan Africa, you're working in China at that time, you're working with the Soviet Union at that time, in that current climate, or in that climate, how were you all able to be successful in collaborating?
Because the scientists shared, quite honestly, a deep sense of existential crisis. Back then, we knew what was happening. We were running models that were predicting the West being on fire. And we were scared shitless.
That makes sense.
We were parents and grandparents, and Kylie, it was you'd work kind of all day, and then you'd kind of go out for a meal or something, and you would kind of sit there across cultures and look at each other and kind of go, oh shit, we've got to figure this out. So it was once again, Kylie, I feel so darn lucky, to ask that. If you think about that really simple question, is this climate change or natural variability, opened up this world. So,
wow. So one more piece, with all of everything you've said, all of your experience, all of your education, all of your collaboration, and then working within Creation Care Ministry, what are some of the things that you've loved about working in Creation Care, and some of the specific work that we've done in Creation Care that really speak to your heart?
You know what? we have some senior members of that team that have been working tirelessly, particularly since the 70s. You think of like the first Earth Day 50 years ago.
Mhm.
And they work with such wisdom and patience and grace, and the piece of me that feels kind of panicked and impatient feels so grounded by their presence, and they're just amazing, and it it just keeps me going.
That's
You know,
beautiful.
you've seen them. I'm seeing that
Oh, yes.
nod. It's
It's true.
they're beautiful.
Hmm.
They're just beautiful.
It's true. Yeah.